Look at this beautiful pinafore. I made it using the free Milton Pinafore pattern and it worked out perfectly. In this video, I'll show you how to sew it step by step. I will explain you how to finish the neckline without the lining being visible, the easiest way to sew in the pockets, and a very professional way of sewing on buttons that I learned in university. The first step was to take all of the 50 pages and tape them together. I realized that I did not only print size 34 to 46, but also 46 to 60, which I have absolutely no use for, so make sure you're just printing the necessary pages. Next, I cut out the bodice pieces. Then I took out my lining fabric and pressed it. And guys, pressing this was such a pain with this miniature iron with no steam and no proper ironing board. I ended up splashing water on the fabric with my hand to somehow get rid of all the wrinkles. I just finished to cut out all the bodice pieces from my lining fabric in order to create a mock-up to see whether this size fits me, and hopefully it does. Next, I will assemble this, and I didn't really look into the instructions yet, so I'm very curious to see how this is being assembled, because up till now I always kind of knew where a pattern piece has to go just by looking at it, but with this pattern I don't really have a clue. So we're gonna figure it out. I realized I had to wind up new bobbin in white, but then I remembered that I bought this little box, so I could just take a new spool and wind up the thread. I started by closing up the darts, sewing from the edge towards the point. Then I put the back pieces on top of the front pieces, lining up the little notch and closed up the shoulder seam. The mock-up fits pretty well. All I did was to shorten the straps. I just sewed them with a 4 cm seam allowance, and now they are actually lying on my shoulders. So now I can cut out all of these bodice pieces from my main fabric, and then I'm gonna use the mock-up as my lining. First, I was able to cut out the skirt pattern because I now knew my size. I lengthened the skirt by 6 cm because I like my skirts a little longer. Then I made sure all the pieces have room on the fabric and cut them out. Therefore, I took the fabric and folded it along the grain line. Then I put the pattern piece on top, pinned it in place, cut it out. And very important before removing the pins is to mark all of the notches. The back are 2 separate pieces, but I also cut it on fold and then cut it open. I also cut out the bodice pieces. Once again, I started with closing up the darts. As you can see, I used thread to mark the dart point and not pencil, because pencil is impossible to remove. Then I closed up the shoulder seams with 4 cm seam allowance. Next, I had to remove the waistband from the mock-up because the waistband has to be made from the outer fabric. Then I cut off 2 mm around the neckline of the lining, only the lining, and overlocked all of the raw edges. Afterwards, I put the pieces right sides together and sewed around the inner neckline. In the center front, I sewed a curve because it's easier to turn than a corner. Then I pressed the seam allowance towards the lining and understitched the neckline. Next, I also closed up the sides and turned the straps inside out. Finally, I folded the sides of the top open, attached the waistband pieces, and pressed the seam allowance towards the waistband. Ta-da! The bodice is finished and I really like how it's looking. The only thing I don't really like is that it's gaping a little bit here at the side, but I don't really know what to do about it, so it's just gonna stay that way. I'm also very happy how well it all went together, because when I realized that the waistband is only going until this point, I got a little bit skeptical, but it all worked out. And I guess it's now time to start working on the skirt. The first step was to close up the back skirt darts, just like once on the bodice. Then I pressed the darts towards the center back. Next, I took both pockets and put them right sides together to the skirt pieces and sewed them in place. I just attached the pocket with quite a small seam allowance because I thought that I have to close up the side seam with a 6mm seam allowance. But I just took a look into the instructions and I realized that it's actually supposed to be a French seam. So 2 times 6mm, which is actually 12mm, which already makes a lot more sense. But I'm just gonna leave this pocket seam like this and just close up the side seam with a 12mm seam allowance and overlock it, because that's a whole lot easier than doing a French seam with the pocket. So I overlocked the sides, pressed the seam allowance towards the pockets, top stitched the seam allowance to the pocket so it won't peek out in the end, and closed up the side seams, putting the pockets to the inside and leaving an opening to be able to put my hand into the pocket. I also created a bar tag at the pocket opening to strengthen the seam. Lastly, I closed up the bottom of the pocket. I just finished to close up the side seams and it took forever. I had to redo this pocket area like a million times because my pressure foot would always slide to the side because of this thicker area of fabric. So the next step is to create this buttonhole area at the back of the skirt and then attach the skirt to the waistband. Using a basting stitch, I secured the pockets to the waist. To create the button area, I folded over the back edge once 3 cm and then another time and stitched the button placket in place. It's easier to sew from the inside, but the seam looks better sewn from the outside, so pick what you prefer. I sewed from the outside. Next, I put the waistband right sides together with the skirt and sewed them together. To prepare for finishing the inside, I pressed the lining edge of the waistband over about 8 mm. Next, I folded the end of the waistband right sides together and closed up the short edge. Then I turned it using the method where you fold the seam allowance along the seam and hold it in place while turning. Then, very slowly, careful not to sew on the bodice but on the skirt, I stitched in the ditch to secure the waistband in place. Lastly, I folded over the bottom edge of the skirt twice and sewed it. All of the construction is finished and it's looking really nice and clean, also from the inside. So now all that's left to do is to make the buttons and the buttonholes. And my sewing machine doesn't have a buttonhole setting, it's just straight stitch or zigzag stitch. So it's kind of a pain to make buttonholes with it, but I just gonna do it anyways. But it's gonna take a while. First, I marked all of the buttonholes and made a test buttonhole to make sure the button fits through and it's looking good. Then I sewed one buttonhole after another, which took me about an hour. I created the short stitch with 2.5 mm width and 0 length, and the long stitch with 0.5 mm width and 0.5 mm length. Lastly, I had to sew on all of the buttons, which took me about 3 hours. First, I created a knot at the end of my thread. Then I evenly put the buttonholes on top of the other side, and with the needle I went through the center of the buttonhole. On the other side, I made sure I'm really in the center and went through the fabric and back to the right side. Then I went through in between the 2 threads, right underneath the knot. Next, I just went up and down through the button and the fabric, not pulling it too tight. Always align the direction of the button with the direction of the buttonhole. After going down, I went up in between button and fabric and started wrapping the thread around the button. In every round, I created a loop which creates a knot. Lastly, I pulled on the thread until it ripped, which tightens up the knots. It is finished and I think it looks lovely. It is not what I usually wear, but I'm very excited to wear it. And about the pattern, I think it worked out amazing. I had no problems at all to put this all together. At first I was a bit confused by all of the notches and everything you have to mark, but it really helped in the end to put everything together, and the notches always lined up, so nothing was out of place or something. The only things I changed was to shorten the straps, but it's also mentioned in the pattern that you should adjust the strap length. And I also lengthened the skirt and did the pockets a bit differently, but just because I think it's easier. So all in all, I can definitely 100% recommend this pattern. Right now, without further ado, let's have a look at the finished dress. I hope you enjoyed watching the video, and if you want to see me test another free spring pattern, go check out this video where I make a green linen dress. See you!